Welcome to You Can Talk to Me, a Beatles podcast. It's time to make our way across the universe and talk all things John, Paul, George and Ringo.
Jeff Slate, thank you for joining me here on You Can Talk to Me. It's a great honour to have your company.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Jeff, you've had a terrific life and continue to do so, immersed in rock and roll, and you never seem to have wanted to be placed into a box. When I look back at the career so far, you're an artist in your own right. You've been a great, and continue to be, a great musical collaborator. You seem to enjoy collaboration. You're also a highly regarded music journalist. But before we kind of touch into those points and talk all things Beatles along the way, how did music enter your life?
You know, it's funny. I never remember a time when it wasn't there. You know, so I was born in 1967. And by the time I was sort of aware, music was there. Now, that's largely because I was the youngest, and particularly my brother and sister, they were, in high school and college in the late 60s, early 70s. So even when they weren't around, their record collections were there, right? So as a curious kid, I would peruse these record collections. Because, my mom's record collection was sort of Burt Bacharach and, show tunes and things like that, which is fine, but, and gave me a lot of information for later on in my life. But, I was more intrigued by the records that were in their collections. I remember distinctly finding, being aware of the Monkees. So this is, I was probably 3-4 years old and looking for a Monkees record in there, which I did not find, by the way. Thank God. No, we'll talk about that. But I found Revolver, and the back of Revolver,
wow,
had kind of I thought, oh, these guys kind of look like the Monkees. I couldn't read, so I was like, I put it on my little close and play. And I remember Taxman was kind of confusing, and then Eleanor Rigby comes on. And I remember being so young that it was scary. There was something like almost, there was the intensity of it was a little bit scary. But I couldn't stop listening to it, right? And so I then figured out the guys who went with that and the other. So with that record, I also had an American version of Rubber Soul and a record called Introducing the Beatles, which is essentially the VJ record was Please Please Me, right? And so those were really, besides what was on the radio and what was being played in the house, those were the beginning of my record collection, right? Now, I was very fortunate because they had pretty diverse record collections that would go all the way from, the Beach Boys to the Who and the Kinks, and, sort of it was all over the place. It was a really fertile time for music. But that was my introduction. And then look, we didn't have YouTube or any of these other things. So when you would see a performance on television, and there were a lot of variety shows and daytime variety shows here in America, there were always musical performances. So I remember seeing Little Richard at a very young age, and my grandfather being very disapproving. I remember seeing, John and Yoko when they co-hosted the Mike Douglas show for a week. I remember seeing, Iggy Pop and David Bowie on Dinah Shore in the middle of the afternoon. It was just like, we didn't have YouTube, so we would really latch on to these performances and every moment of them. The other thing that was really significant, I remember very, very early in life, before I even started going to the midnight showings of, Yellow Submarine or Let It Be or whatever, there was a local station where I lived that played Saturday afternoon double features. So you'd get, Vincent Price or Bruce Lee, and occasionally you'd get A Hard Day's Night in Hell. And, I remember it was a double feature, A Hard Day's Night in Hell. That transported me. I could not believe that these guys weren't fictional characters. It was too much to comprehend that they were real flesh and blood people. And I knew, obviously I knew they existed in real life. They'd broken up by that time that I saw that. But it was just, those movies, when you can only see them maybe once every 3 or 6 months, and you've got to be there at noon on Saturday afternoon to catch them. There's something really exciting about that and really electric about that. And so that made me a fan, not just of the Beatles, who I consumed voraciously. And of course, everybody had in my neighborhood, the older kids or neighbors or whatever, they'd already consumed these records. So they were really happy to let me borrow them because they were into the fact that I was just like, this, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 8-year-old kid who was just like obsessed. Like my friends were obsessed with Kiss. And I was like, John Lennon, please. So that was the introduction. And then, it was sort of a natural progression from there, but it was led by the fact that I had these older siblings and my brother-in-law, who was really significant as well. He was a jazz trumpet player, but he was in the New York City music scene. So I inherited a lot of records from him, and he would make me mixtapes, and and that gave me a real love because he played sessions with like the Spinners and toured with the Spinners and the Platters, and some of these other records, that I would get, like Isley Brothers records and the OJs and the Delphonics, and not stuff my friends were listening to. This was just I had a very eccentric taste, but a very eccentric collection. So that was, that's all sort of pre-75, before I was like fully aware. It was just sort of coming at me as fast as I could get it. And that, I think that's why, you say, journeyman or eclectic, or I've done all these, it's like the people who box themselves in, I think are doing themselves a disservice as a creative person. Yeah. But we can get to that. Yeah. I'm sure you have a follow-up to that. That was a lot.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. It sounds like you're obviously growing up with so much around you from a musical perspective. When do you decide that, and did you immediately go to the guitar? When was it an idea that, I want to play?
No, I did. And I got a little cheapy organ that my grandmother had, and started teaching myself that. I got a guitar one Christmas, but I was like 8, and your hands just aren't big enough at 8 years old to really do anything but kind of Batman or Jingle Bells or whatever. So, and I had a teacher who was like, of the old school. I wanted to play, Imagine or Yesterday, or We Can Work It Out, whatever I wanted to play. And he had the book with the dots and the, it just wasn't happening for me. So I sort of abandoned that at 8, but I remember really distinctly, I bought a drum set at, I don't think I've ever talked about this on a podcast, but I bought a drum set at like a yard sale, right? And told all my friends we're starting a band, and invited them all down, and everybody came. One kid came with a trumpet. A couple of kids had like, those cheapy acoustics that you get from a toy shop. Yeah. And, I think one kid had like a ukulele or, whatever, banjolele, and I had this drum set. Now we didn't, we were 8, we had no idea what we were doing. I remember after one rehearsal, we kicked one kid out because he didn't have the right attitude. It was just, we had big ideas, but we were little kids. So by the time I was about, 12, I think, I had a paper route, saved up my money. You get Christmas tips at the holidays, and I saved up and I bought I wanted a Hofner bass, right? Had my dad drive me, like 100 miles to this store that had one, and it wasn't like today. And started taking lessons from this guy who was the bass player for Barnum and Bailey, right? The circus. It was so, so bizarre. And his condition was he would teach me anything I wanted. Hi, or Junior's Farm, or, whatever it was. Jet, I remember, was a big one. But I had to give him a certain amount of time every lesson on the upright bass.
Right.
So he was, he sort of coerced me into learning more than I kind of, wanted or needed to. And I joined a band. I was in a band by 13 with some older kids. We would rehearse, until we got caught with moonshine or whatever we had, and the cooler in the back of the amp leaked. It was very exciting for us. And we would play. I remember Live Peace in Toronto was a big record because we could play those songs.
Yeah.
They're simple and there's they're not the full arrangements. They're just winging it, right? So we could do that. We could play sort of bare bones rock and roll. But a buddy of mine, and so I had already, had gone through the whole Beatles catalog by that time, or as much as I could get my hands on, and a lot of R&B. And I remember at one of the rehearsals, one of the older kids brought, I think it was like on a Thursday or Friday, brought My Generation by The Who. There are but four small faces. And the Jam EP here, which had Absolute Beginners and Funeral Pyre and a couple of other songs. And I think Sound Effects too by the Jam. And I, like that weekend, that was, sort of what I think of as, my origin story as a musician. I mean, those records changed my life because the Beatles felt like you could never be that. They were so cool and they looked so good and the songs were perfect and they were, but like, Can't Explain feels like a song any band can play. And it feels, even though you can't just write Can't Explain, it feels like you can, And so that was a real sort of turning point. And I became aware that, and it was also, say what you will about those early Who records, which I only was aware of, like Quadrophenia and Who's Next and Tommy. This was a different version of the Who, and it became really obvious to me that there was a through line from those records and the Small Faces and the early Kinks records to punk and what was happening in real time. So the Jam were a band that were happening at that time. The Clash were happening. I got to see them many, many times, got to know them, so there was stuff going on that and again, there was no YouTube, there was no, it was mysterious, these guys were all super enigmatic. Rolling Stone ever came once every 2 weeks, and that was all we had for information, Hit Parader and these other magazines that we had, they were not really the real thing. Rolling Stone was as close as you got to boots on the ground information. So it was a really, you're finding your way, you're teaching yourself instruments. I was teaching myself guitar by that time and piano. I had given up the lessons on the bass, so I'm teaching myself basically by playing in a band.
Yeah.
And people are like, how can you sing and play bass at the same time? I didn't know that wasn't a thing. I just did it. I had to sing and play bass. And that was how I learned to play the bass. And it became, I wanted to write songs, so I just did it. I didn't really know how. I didn't really know that there were rules or whatever. I just knew, I remember walking home from school. I was, not even probably, 12 or 13 and humming a George Harrison song in my head and then changing the words and then getting home and making up a new tune. And that wasn't the first song I wrote, but it was close. And it was like, okay, well, maybe that's a shortcut. And then I sort of figured out, okay, well, there's a structure but it's all, there weren't YouTube videos for this thing. It was like, we're figuring this out. You're trying to find like-minded people and so forth. So it was a real, you're really in the dark, but it's incredibly exciting. And I was by by 13, because I played a lot of sports as a kid, by 13, I had figured, that rock and roll was a hell of a lot more fun than, sports. Only the top kids were ever going to go anywhere in that. But anybody could be in a rock and roll band. Anybody could play at parties. The girls all loved it. You made a little bit of money. What more does any 13, 14, 15-year-old kid need?
Yeah.
I remember one gig, 14, 15 years old, this girl hired us for her birthday party. We played on her tennis court. And I just remember it being so much fun. I'm sure we were terrible, right? But it doesn't matter because you're sort of writing the rules as you go along, and everybody's into it, and you're really into it, and it's incredibly exciting,
That's a real punk kind of attitude too, in its own way. And you talked about punk, and I wouldn't mind diving into that. An extension from the period you're talking about, where we get into that New York scene, late 70s, early to mid 80s, and the Mindless Thinkers. I was listening to a recording recently.
Which discovered. Is like I found it. I didn't even know it was out there. In another podcast, you mentioned it. It's like a tape of a tape of a tape.
Yeah,
it's really.
It's lo-fi, but it which is part of the appeal. But I remember just looking at the type set or the typewritten credits on the cassette image that's there.
Yeah.
And you kind of look at it fleetingly, but then you dig into it, and the people that are being thanked, and there's a mention to Joe Strummer, and it goes on. Rather than me tell that story, I'm curious about. I'd love to hear the story about that name for that band, because I think that sounds remarkable. That scene, when you enter that scene. Can you describe that period? I can only imagine what it was like, because am I right? Was that still coming out of that grimy kind of New York period where, you've got the Blondies, you've got that scene at the CBGBs.
Yeah.
Were you entering in at the back of that?
Yes. I mean, it was still pretty fertile, but by the time we got there, and, we played CBs, and I'll tell you the way it happened for me. I can't, there were other guys in the band, so I can only sort of tell my version of it, because it's like anthology. I'm sure we all disagree. But, so after that weekend and that sort of origin story, I became completely enamored with the Jam, and had discovered around that time too the Clash. And, those were bands, and the Kinks were playing a lot. So I went to see all these bands. I remember my brother-in-law and sister lived right near Times Square, took me to Bonds, took me to the Clash on the pier here. I was sort of 13, 14, 15 years old, got to meet them because my friends and I would take the bus in, or don't tell my mom, hitchhike into New York City. But I had been coming into New York City to see music, 8, 9 years old. I remember my mom would put me on the train, like this 3-hour train ride into New York City with my little boombox in my bag, all by myself. And my sister would meet me at Penn Station, and they would I saw Miles Davis, I saw the Kinks, and I saw, I think, Peter Frampton, and I saw all these bands that were, some were cooler than others, but it was all there, and it was really exciting to see. I got to see jazz, a lot of jazz guys who are no longer with us, or who were really young at that time, who are now, like the Marsalis brothers, and Miles is a really good example. That I didn't understand what I was seeing, but my brother-in-law was in that scene, so I would get to meet these guys. It was very cool. So by the time I saw the Clash, I was old enough that and committed enough, and had a group of friends who were just as crazy as I was, that we would come into the city at the drop of a hat and sort of, we're gonna go find where the Clash are, right? And we would interact. I remember wanting to interview them for I remember calling up I think it was Epic Records or something, wanting to interview them for I think I named my high school paper. They didn't know, it's just like, I'm writer for the blah, blah, blah. Sure, come on down. They're recording an Electric Lady. We'd knock on the door and they'd be like, the fuck is this? Who's this 16-year-old kid? But it was, but they were so, the punk ethos was so cool that they were just like, yeah, sure, come on in. I'll talk to you, and I got to know the guys around them who I'm still friends with. I mean, that's the crazy thing. Don Letts, Cosmo Vinyl, and the guys in the Clash as well. I still talk to these guys all the time. Steve Jones from the Pistols. It's funny. He was. I'll tell the mindless thinker story in a second. But I remember really vividly going to those punk clubs, and there were a couple of things. First of all, it was the tail end, so I'll disclaim it that way. But the guys I met were either or both strung out or angry. And, granted, a lot of the guys that I was meeting had been passed over or were members of bands who were not the focal point. But by the same token, if you talk to them for any length of time, they were really dismissive. Now, this is the New York punk scene. They were really dismissive of anything new, anything black, anything. And what I quickly realized was it was you would think it was like this really open, cool scene. The bands that succeeded did it really quickly and got out. The ones who were very New York centric came from, a lot of them came from Queens or, Brooklyn to a certain degree, but a lot from Queens, and were products of the sort of white flight that had happened in the 70s where, the neighborhoods became integrated. There was integration in the busing, and a lot of their families got, the parents and grandparents got angry. They moved out of those areas. They had, so a lot of these guys, when you talk to them for any length of time, they were just really racist. Meanwhile, up the street, there was, I'm really literally just a couple of blocks away from CBGB's, was this place called Club Na Grill, where Don Letts, who made West Way to the World, the Clash documentary, but he also made the Rock the Casbah video, and he's a filmmaker, but he was a DJ. And he's the guy who he's famous for having introduced all the punks in London to reggae. And he was also Bob Marley's weed dealer in London. So, impeccable credentials from my 15-year-old, 16-year-old perspective.
Fantastic.
And he was the DJ at this club. And some of the other guys would DJ. I remember Paul Simonon DJing occasionally, and Cosmo would DJ, whatever. And their crew would be there. But the kids who were there were like the young Beastie Boys and their circle, and Basquiat would be there. And it was, not all, it wasn't a cool night every night, but it was a cool scene, right? And so the music that would get played, they would play old school, they'd play rockabilly, you'd hear like Gene Vincent or, Eddie Cochran, you'd hear, reggae, you'd hear dub, which we didn't know even what that was. You'd hear ska, you'd hear, sort of rude boy stuff. You'd hear the beginnings of hip hop and rap, because that was sort of percolating. And as a young white kid from Connecticut, that was not something that I'd been exposed to. I mean, pretty much all we'd heard was Rapture and The Message. And early on coming to visit New York, Magnificent Seven, the summer of '81 was like everywhere, coming out of everywhere. That's how I remember it.
Yeah.
But that's it. So you're now hearing what like these white label records that people are making, at home or on a budget or, whatever. And it was really, the Beasties at that point were like a hardcore band that were sort of finding their way into the hip hop scene. And a lot of other people were just like art school students or art school bands. You'd go to parties at apartments that were like completely empty. It's just a squat or something, and it would be, one light bulb and everybody plugged into one amp and a violinist and a saxophone. It was just nuts. But it was very egalitarian. It was very cool. It was very relaxed. It was, the thing about the CB scene, particularly by that time, it was hard drugs. There was a sadness to it, you know. Whereas this was exciting and fun, and it was just weed. It was harmless, you know. It was a really, really nice feeling and very accepting. And nobody cared that you were a 16-year-old kid from Connecticut. Like in the CB's crowd, like that wasn't cool. Yeah. That was like you're a rich kid, you're pretending. You know, there was none of that with these guys. They didn't care. You'd meet a Jamaican guy with a machete, and he didn't care. You know, the machete wasn't for you; it was for the guys who didn't pay. So that was, you know, that was sort of the beginning of, you know, trying to find my own way through all these other styles that were sort of percolating at the time. And also MTV was happening. Yeah. So it was a really confusing time stylistically, and technology was exploding and synthesizers and drum machines and all that stuff. You know, but by the same token, the stuff that I loved was, you know, the Who and the Small Faces and those R&B records, and, you know, the Star Club tapes and the early, you know, the BBC records, the BBC recordings were starting to get bootlegged. You know, that was a really exciting, like there wasn't much difference to me between those Who records and the BBC Beatles and the Small Faces and the Clash and the Jam, right? They all felt like they were on one continuum, right? And that was really cool to me. So that was sort of, you know, that's quite a long version of the origin story. But that was, you know, I'm reluctant to talk about the New York punk scene because I do have a lot of friends who came up through that and friends who are still part of it and love it. But it never spoke to me. I'll say the other thing was the English bands always had great rhythm sections. They had a killer drummer bass player thing, all of them. The Damned and the Clash and the Jam, and it was just like exceptional. And they all swung. They were rock and roll. And the thing that was always lacking to me in those bands that I saw before I was a player, and then also, and I'm talking about the sort of New York punk bands, Clem Burke, God love him, R.I.P., Accepted. They didn't swing, you know. They were very boom, tap, boom, boom, tap. And they were very rudimentary. And the thing about the records that I loved, Mooney and Kenny Jones, and, you know, they swung, man. They were so cool, you know. Paul Cook, he's, you know, yes, he's a really from the Sex Pistols, really meat and potatoes drummer, but he swings. The roll is there, you know. And so that, you know, it's maybe a bit snobby, but I was always looking for that. That was a really hard, you know, in America, a lot of times you get a drummer, he's just a guy who hits things. And that isn't really what it's about for me, right? So.
Could you just share in that space the story? I'd just love to understand it, how it came about with the naming of the Mindless Thinkers. Can we just talk about how that goes on? I can't think of anyone else that's got quite a story like that.
Yeah, well, so, you know, we were obviously, from telling this story, we were incredibly precocious kids and, you know, driven, but fearless, right? We just didn't, you know, the thing about growing up in the punk ethos is we just didn't give a fuck. You know, it was like we weren't going to be told no. We were going to be told we couldn't get in. We weren't going to be told there was always a back door. And I mean that literally at gigs, but also figuratively. I mean, the first time I saw the Pistols was the Professionals so that's, you know, Matlock and Jonesy and Cookie playing without Johnny Rotten, right? Because that was how we saw them. And we were 13 and we snuck in the back door of the local club that they were just passing through. Shitty gig, right? But that was, you know, they needed money to keep the lights on and keep the heroin flowing, I guess, or Jonesy did. So, you know, we're a little bit older and we work ourselves into a gig by the band Checkered Past. I remember that we were opening for them. The other guys don't. I guess we weren't. But I know we had a band that had a terrible name, and it was a three-piece, kind of punky, loud and fast, but it did swing, band. And we went up to Steve Jones, and I think Nigel Olsson from Blondie was in that band. Clem Burke was there, Michael DeBar was there. It was a really cool band. And said, fans, and we really need a name for our band. Jonesy was trashed already. He was like, come back after the show and I'll give you a name. And so we went back after the show, and I don't know if he'd come up with it or he just came up with it on the spot, but he said, oh, you guys should be the Mindless Thinkers. That was it. Right. Yeah. And we were like, we could never, 3 teenage kids and all our friends could never agree on a name. But when you have this thing, we would do college radio interviews and tell that story. It's like, how can you not use that name? Even if it's a terrible name, which it's, I like it, but I don't know. I've heard both. But when you tell that story, which he doesn't remember any of it, by the way.
Sure.
We've talked about it since. It was just like, it had that, it had the seal of approval to it.
Yeah.
But it also had, how can we not call ourselves that?
There was a real, when I listen to those initial recordings, there seems to be, it's almost like I get the sense you can't help yourself but infuse a pop sensibility into that punk sound. It feels like it's got this hybrid thing. You seem, through the catalogue of your work, there's a real strong sense of pop structure and melody. Even in spite of...
Well, the jam were, when I was writing those songs, the jam were hugely important to me.
Yeah. And
the thing, they were a band that they were having hit singles, not in America, but, they were having hit singles, and they were, they were a big deal in England. And I would get the Enemy or the other papers that were around at the time, and they were all over it, and the Clash. So it's, we wanted to be the Clash, but we didn't have the organ. We didn't have the second guitar player. There were a lot of elements, but the jam as a 3-piece, it was like, okay, well, it's punky, it's fast, and it's loud, but it's got to have that. It's got to have that structure. It's got to have a melody, right? And I think the reason that came up is because we started doing gigs really early on, and we were rehearsing a lot, and our friends would come. And the response to the songs that were punky was kind of like, this is MTV era, it was kind of like, all right. And people would dance, but they were, but the songs that had a melody, that had a structure to them, people responded to, they came closer. They were like, oh, what was that one? Oh, I like that one about, And so, when people are responding to something, you feel like you're sort of cracking the code on songwriting. Because the early attempts are, they're pretty rough. They just are. Yeah. But when you're getting real time feedback like that, and look, truth be told, you get girls go, I like that song. You're sitting in algebra class, a girl in front of you turns. This is true, 100% true. Oh, that song, and the guy's droning on it. That song you played on Saturday, that was really good. I'm like, all right, I'm going to do another one like that. What more does a young kid want, right?
Yeah, that's great. When you spend so much time in that city, and it seems to be in your bones, do you get a sense of why, I guess, to talk Lennon for a moment, do you get a sense of why a character like Lennon fell in love so hard with New York? It seemed to be a city that really spoke to him. He talked a lot about it, he sang about it. Can you give us a sense of the why behind that, do you think?
Well, the New York that people come and experience now is the same New York, but it's also a very different version of New York. The New York that John fell in love with, which I was lucky enough to experience as a young kid, was very like the Liverpool I experienced before it got kind of made over for the tourist industry, right? It was bustling and grimy and most everything happened after hours, right? But also, you would be, look, I remember being at a payphone and tapping my, when we had payphones, tapping my foot because the guy in front of me was taking so long. And he turned around and it was Andy Warhol, right? And I'm like, that wouldn't, everybody's in a town car, or everybody's in a, some kind of limousine, or, they're being bustled back and forth by their publicist. Everybody's handled now. Back then, I remember giving Keith Richards a demo tape because I ran into him on the street.
Come on.
Just walking home. He and Patty were literally stumbling home. And I chased them down a block later to give him this. I realized I had a tape with me. And it's like, so you would go to a club. You would get, like, your friend would come back. It's like, we got to go over to this club in the West Village. And you'd go, and Grace Jones was performing, and Warhol and Bowie and, like, assorted other, a wild array of people would be in this little club in the West Village. It was a very, very different time. So, and look, I remember hearing, I think it was my brother-in-law told me, he was standing on a corner on the Upper West Side, and he's like, he turns to his right and says, "Oh, there's Woody Allen. That's pretty cool." And they're waiting for the light to change, and the light changes, and they, this guy is coming toward them, and it's John Lennon. And he said he and Woody Allen looked at each other like, "That's fucking John Lennon." Like everybody, like that's a different level of, but I don't think they interacted. I don't think, I think it was one of those things where he was largely left alone, but he knew that he was still secure in the fact that when he was walking around, people knew who he was. He was treated a certain way.
Yeah.
So I think it's, he could claim it was a certain thing, but I think it was, he was still fucking Beatles. So, yeah. But it was an amazing time and an amazing place. And there was so much happening. You think of Liverpool in the early 60s with what became the very polished version of Mercy Beat that we're familiar with. But imagine that 3-4 years earlier, when it was just a kernel of an idea and everybody's sort of fighting for supremacy, right? Well, that's what we had in New York in the 70s and 80s, where it was, you had the Talking Heads and Blondie, and you had the Ramones, and you had all these other bands, and the English bands coming here and trying to make it. And hip hop is happening at the same time. And the, WBLS, which is the big sort of, it was really more a broadly black station at the time. So you get reggae and you get other things on it too. You hear Harry Belafonte, and then you'd hear, Grandmaster Flash. It was a bonkers station, but that was great. That was WBAI as well, but which is the public station. But that was all happening, all at once. And it was both a lawless time, because Times Square was just a cesspool. Watch Taxi Driver, and it was that and worse, really, when you were walking it. But there was some beauty to that. There was something, it was incredibly dangerous, but it was also, the cool factor was incredibly high, and you knew it. You just knew that. So, and a guy like John Lennon, I think, he's a guy, he talked about this in Making Records. It wasn't about the instrumentation. It wasn't about the structure. It wasn't about the words. It was, what did the record sound like? Did it move you? He was a guy who operated a lot on vibe and feel and, that kind of thing. And I think the vibe and feel of New York City at that time was incredibly, incredibly special, as dangerous as it was. And clearly, that changed all of our lives for that. But it was, I've never said this before, but I've thought this. If John knew that the price to pay maybe before Sean came along and whatever, but because I think his opinion about life changed as he got older and so forth. But if he knew the price he had to pay for being a New Yorker was that it was only going to be 10 years, I don't know. I mean, that was a really important time in his life.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No, it's well said. It's funny. I hear you talk about that period and the city, the nature of the city. I remember hearing an interview with Pacino talking about walking through Central Park one day, as Al Pacino would tell the story, and he's walking along one morning and I look up, and there he is. And it's John and Yoko.
Yeah.
And he said that they were walking toward him. And he said, there was a little part of me, the boy and the man, which never goes away, right? A little part of him that wanted to say, hey, John, I'm a fan, big fan. And then the other part of him that knew, you know what, leave the man alone. Like I'd like to be left alone. And he said, just as they walked toward each other, and he's having that thought, he's looking at Lennon, and Lennon looked at him, and it was around the time of Godfather 2 or something, I think. He tells the story. And Lennon smiled and just nodded, and he just smiled and nodded, and they kept walking. And he described that it felt like there was this little micro moment of, I know, and I know, and not a word spoken. And that seems to be a little bit of what you're describing with the nature of that city.
Well, look, I think it's true. It's a little more invasive these days, I have to say. But look, I'm known just a little bit. I get recognized occasionally. People are, because they feel like they know you from social media, they're more intrusive than I think they used to be. But there's always, except for John Lennon, there's always somebody more famous, So everybody has this attitude like, I'm a New Yorker, I'm pretty cool. Oh, here comes Al Pacino, I'm not so fucking cool. But however, that leads to that kind of cool, hey, because I've seen, certainly back in the day, and even to a certain degree now, you see people around, and you don't want to infringe on their space, their time, it's anybody who gets recognized at all can relate to what that intrusiveness feels like. So I think it's incredibly insightful coming from him. But I think even fans who, you don't want to be, if you're at your desk, you don't want people coming by and bothering you. You just, I mean, it's like nobody wants to be bothered on their off time. It's just so, yeah.
There's a comment I read some time ago. I think it's in an interview. It might even be in the documentary Lennon NYC, where Jack Douglas is reflecting back on the Hit Factory and the Double Fantasy Milk and Honey sessions. And he says that he's often asked, what was John really like? And he makes the comment that, to paraphrase him, if you want to know what John Lennon was like and who he was, he's right there. Yeah. You can hear him in the lyrics. You can hear him in the sound of his playing. That is who he was. And that was the guy that would sit with you in between the playing. When you've sat with friends, Earl Slick, Bob Gruen, who are, all those things that New York seem to be in my mind. I think Bob even takes a photograph for you on the cover of your last album, Last Days of Summer. There's a great connection there. And obviously Bob had a terrific connection there with John. Took some of the greatest photographs of his entire life. And when
we did those photos right over near the Bank Street apartment.
Oh man, that's amazing. Yeah. Come on.
Yeah. I know. I didn't realize it until after. I mean, you would think as a Beatle nut, you're like, of course you knew that. But, I was walking home and I went by that area and I was like, oh my God, Bob still lives over here, Yeah. It's nuts. But anyway, I'm sorry.
No, I'm just curious, when you sit with these guys who are, they're friends, when conversations turn to John, does Jack Douglas's recollection ring true? That was the man.
Yeah, well, yes. The short answer is yes. I think the difficulty is, so there was a book that came out maybe 6 months ago that was taken from all the interviews that Peter Brown did for his book. And it's all of them sort of strung together in a sort of chronology. So you're getting Ringo and George and Paul being interviewed at a time when John was still alive, right? They end sort of in 1980 or so. And so these are guys who, you know, I'm not saying they weren't the Beatles. Obviously, they were always the Beatles, but it was different in the 70s. You know, they were able to be flesh and blood people. You know, Paul, we forget this, but anybody who's read the Red and Blue books that have come out recently, you know, he clawed his way back to being sort of Beatle Paul, you know, and George had a love-hate relationship with that existence. Ringo, you know, went through a lot, which he's talked about, you know, his alcoholism and so on and so forth. In the 70s, they were just guys trying to find their way. They were still having hit records and insulated to a certain degree because they were Beatles, but they did go out, you know, they did go for a meal, they did go to a diner, they did get, you know, if they were in New York City, they walked the streets, you know, I mean, just like everybody else. It wasn't all limousine rides the way it is now. So I think it's very true, partly because, yes, John and Yoko lived in that bubble the last 5 years, but he was out and about. I mean, you know, if you lived in New York City, people saw him. They saw him at the Y, they saw him at Cafe La Fortuna, they saw him in the neighborhood, just sort of walking around. There's still a picture in a vitamin shop on the Upper West Side, because that's where he used to get his vitamins. You know, it's like, really? You know, it's like 45 years later. So I think he never got to the point, you know, now we think of Paul and Ringo, they're very untouchable, you know, they're older guys, they're surrounded by minders, you only get to them if you have a reason, you know, and they, I think, would maybe don't want it to be that way, and maybe argue to a certain degree that it's not that way, but that's the reality. I mean, if you're Paul McCartney, there's lots of layers before you get to Paul. And I've been around, you know, in rooms with both of them, and, you know, dealt with Ringo on many occasions, but you do have this sense of kind of history that I think maybe didn't exist at that time. So I think John was a guy who was very, what you see is what you get, but it was also a different time in the culture. So I think he never got, you know, he didn't live long enough to be part of that sort of celebrity bubble culture. And, you know, sadly, but it's kind of beautiful that it's like Bobby Kennedy, you know, you sort of remember him as this perfect character. And yet they were complicated guys. And if they'd lived long enough, who knows what would have become of them. But, you know, the anybody I've talked to, Slick, the guys from Elephant's Memory, you know, Sean or Bob Gruen, you know, any of these guys who interacted with him in any meaningful way. I've got the keyboard player in my band delivered John's keyboards and recording equipment to the Dakota and installed it for him and showed him how it worked. And, you know, pretty crazy. You know, they all say that same thing. He was just kind of like the guy, you know. The other thing is many competing thoughts here, but the other thing was they were filmed. John and Yoko were on film in unguarded moments, much more than anybody else, you know, even more than Paul and Linda. You know, they were really who really sculpted a kind of a version for the public to see. You know, we did get all these snippets of film, even when that wasn't a thing. You know, they did do that week on Mike Douglas. They did do the Dick Cavett show all the time. They did, you know, you would see John at, you know, the circus, and John at the, you know, deli, and John, you know, there was always footage of them just kind of being. So I think we had a different perspective of him too. But the short answer, though, I think is yes, except, you know, the guys who were with him in the studio were aware that there was something else going on. You know, I talked to the guys who did, when they did the Mind Games box a year or so ago, which I recommend to everybody if they haven't heard it.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
It's amazing. And, these are guys who are pretty jaded A-list session players. Keltner is another who I played with, the
Wow.
drummer Jim Keltner, who, when they talk about John, it's even different than the other A-list players that they played with. And I think part of what was so beautiful about him was that he kind of was uncomfortable with being on, I'm John Lennon. He wanted to be in a band. He wanted to be a regular guy. He wanted to be, but he also didn't live long enough. George was like that, I think, in the 70s, right? And then the 80s sort of retreated after having some bad experiences with the record business. But when he came back out in the early 90s and was around, he was just sort of a guy, It wasn't really until after Anthology, and they sort of became the Beatles in big bold letters, that the celebrity culture consumed them, and they had to be more careful for obvious reasons. But I think, John just wasn't part of that world. But again, Slick talks about him because he was John Lennon. It was a long time ago, and it was a really cool experience to sit with John Lennon and play guitars, or have John sneaking chocolate and hiding it and don't tell Yoko. I mean, that's nuts to anybody,
There's a great interview where Slick's talking about the first time walking into the Hit Factory and sitting with John, having a conversation. I'm sure you've heard all this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. And he describes, this is the guy that I remember sitting down and watching on the Ed Sullivan Show. And it changes my brain. And I'm sitting opposite him. I've heard you tell some remarkable stories in past interviews. At a house party, I think it was, and Pete Townshend's on guitar, and you describe covering the Rolling Stones' "Sympathy for the Devil." And I don't want to hijack your story, but I know we're short for time. But I remember you describing beautifully. Yeah, it's a guy I'm hanging with. I know him, and we're talking. We have a connection. But I'm at this house party, and we start playing, and I hear that sound, and
only that guy makes.
Only that guy makes, and there must be those parts of you that just, blows your mind. But when I listen to you speak and think about that young guy getting into those gigs in that early New York City scene and being known, I'm a reporter. Can I have an interview? I mean, it's a kid coming in. There's a sense of fearlessness there that's at a very young age. And I'm just wondering, that seems to be a common trait in the greats. I'm sure when you sit with Dylan, Townsend, the conversations you've had with Ringo, when you do that long enough, over the course of a lifetime, do you get a sense of these common themes?
Well, I think they're at a point in their, it's hard to gauge because I didn't know them. I know my origin story, right? I know that I never would take no for an answer.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I get the impression, certainly with Pete, who I know pretty well, so I can talk maybe more with a little more authority. There is that sense that, he had a brain that was firing all the time, So I think whether it was fearlessness or just, I don't think it was fearlessness with him, but I do think it was just an all-consuming need to do what he wanted to do. So I think, and I think that's probably true. Jimmy Page, certainly, having talked to him many times, there's a point where you're pushing and pushing and pushing because you want to be part of something. And then at a certain moment, you realize you are part of it. And you have that sort of imposter syndrome thing and I think the people who can survive work that through really quickly and get to the other side where they are executing all these ideas that have been percolating as a young person. And then there's other people who, Kurt Cobain is a really good example, who just like he wanted that so badly. He loved the Beatles. He loved Zeppelin. He loved, the Pixies and all these bands. And when he got there, it was, I think, for him, unbearable, right? And I think that is a thing. I think that's a thing that happens to people. I think that happened to Elton. I think he was able to get through it. I think the people I know who are musicians who are sort of over 50, whether they're at my level or, a more rarefied level, who have any kind of career that they can keep all those balls in the air, I hate to say this, but they're sober, right? The guys who are not are either not the front people or kind of, they're in the band, but they're not the focal point of the band, or they're really struggling to sort of maintain a viable career, because it's first of all, it's a different world when you get older, but it's, the business has changed dramatically, but you're also, what's expected of you at 40 or 50 is just very, very, very different. I remember at a certain point in my, 30s where I just kind of couldn't get people. This wasn't true in England, but it was true in America. I couldn't get people to come to gigs. Part of it was people were getting married and they were having kids and they were, they just didn't go to gigs anymore. But part of it was too, they just sort of grown out of that as being part of their lives. And the people who were left were the people who were like the dyed in the wool, music people. And then all of a sudden, sort of in my 40s, the crowds came back. And people would talk to me like, oh, I saw you back, and I remember this, I remember this gig, and I remember this band, and blah, blah, blah. And I told this story to Paul Weller one time, and he said, you know what, man? You didn't die. You survived. And at a certain point, people ascribe a certain level of accomplishment and fame to you, even though maybe you didn't, he's treated like a god most of the time. Yeah. And I'm around him and he's no different than us. He would have this conversation with you just the same way I would, and talk about himself in a very kind of self-effacing way. He's a very regular dude.
Yeah.
But also, he's a little bit older. He's certainly done everything he wanted to do, but he is sober too. So I think there is something about that that's significant in an artist's existence. If you want to keep, you're creating at a different pace and a different level when you're not going through that first rush of creativity that happens from 15 to 25. That's like that's just a magic time, and you can do anything.
Yeah.
It changes. Everything changes, and the world has changed too.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. You've been very generous. I appreciate it. Just a couple more questions.
Are we going to talk about the Beatles?
Well, I feel like in some respects we kind of are, because a lot of what I try and do with this pod is discuss with people the importance of them in their lives. And I think that's coming through with you. I've read a lot of your work. I remember thinking to myself, I think the best Beatles reissue is the Pepper Deluxe for me. I'm sure I'm not alone there, but sonically and just in terms of the packaging, and the gifting of gems in there, I can't even imagine what it must be like when you open up that beautiful book in there, and there you are. I mean, it's integrated into that narrative forever after. Yeah. When did the concept of rock journalism hit you? That aspect of creativity to write?
I think, when I was a teenager, I saw it as a way to get into gigs for free, and I saw it as a way to meet people. And I would show up, and whether or not I was covering the gig or whether or not I was, legit in a meaningful way, I knew who they were. I knew their catalog. I knew what inspired them. I knew why they were doing what they were doing. I had great conversation. Joe Strummer's a great example. He did not treat me like a teenage kid. He talked to me like I don't know if he talked to me like a journalist per se, but he talked to me like I belonged, right? And so that sort of spurred me, and I did a little bit of it when I was young and in high school, and but certainly before I met Townsend and did those recordings with him in the '90s. But there was a certain point in the late 2000s where my band, The Badge, had imploded, and the record business had changed. Napster and all this, LimeWire and whatever. And kids can go look that up. And also I had young kids that I was raising alone, basically, and not basically, and I had to find a way to make money that did not require going on the road, right? Because I had been on the road the early 2000s quite a lot, and I had all these friends, right? I so it was like, okay, well, I will contact Zach Starkey and I will say, how do I interview your dad? Okay, well, this is the person who managed, or his rep, and I would contact you, blah, blah, blah. One of the first big interviews I did was for Esquire with Ringo, right? And then it was Jimmy Page and Elton John, and it was like, okay, well, then the door was open. But that happened for two reasons. First of all, I felt like I belonged. And when I was in a room with those guys, because I'd had a lot of time in that world under my belt. So even though I wasn't fearless at 15, and I've been through the imposter syndrome and out again, and sort of, I could be in a room with Ringo and be like, yeah, okay, well, I belong here. I'm not at his level, but I'm cool here. And they know that.
Incredible.
And they also know you're a musician, right? I mean, I remember, I've told this many times, but I went to David Crosby's hotel room to interview him, and he opened the door and he goes, "You're not one of them. You're one of us." Like, wow. He knew right away, but he'd been doing that his whole career, assessing journalists, right? And he wanted to know, what's your story, right? It was the way I was dressed, or the way I just wasn't afraid. I just had a vibe, I guess. I don't know. But so it quickly became a thing, 2008, 2010, that, was a really easy way to be in the music business adjacent and hanging at gigs with my friends, musicians I knew. And they knew that if I came, I knew my shit, and that I would be fair. I wouldn't always write what they wanted, but I would never be needlessly bitchy or mean or what, it wasn't a gotcha thing, and I also wouldn't tell stuff that they didn't want out there, right? I think that was part of the understanding. And then it really quickly, because, I've been told by both readers and managers that I respect, and artists too, but more the people who sort of actually read the artists don't read the articles after they're out, who say, that I have a way of writing about music that is both knowledgeable about the subject, but also easy to understand for people who don't have a background in music. It doesn't sort of glorify it. It also doesn't dumb it down. And I think that's, I'm a huge, I love music. It's everything in the world to me. It changed my life from a very early stage. Seeing John Lennon on television with Chuck Berry, or Little Richard on television on Dinah Shore, or Mike Douglas in the afternoon in his blue cape. I mean, it was just magnificent. Changed my life forever, right? And I carry those things around with me all the time. I know now it isn't as important to people, but it is to me, and I want to represent that for the people who do still care about it, and I also want to get it down for the people who want to find it. Kids are finding music in such different ways now that they will be listening to, sort of, it might be Wu-Tang Clan, it might be Hendrix, it might be Sly and the Family Stone, it might be the Beatles, but it also might be Ariana Grande, all on the same playlist, and so somebody has to be putting this down in a way that's accessible so that it doesn't feel like, hairy old white guys writing about, I'm a big advocate. There's a huge crop of young female journalists coming up in the rock and roll world. And I'm loving every minute of it because they have a completely different perspective, certainly than everything I read as a kid. Yeah. And sort of Lester Bangs accepted, it was a lot of like, well, let me tell you about rock and roll. Come on, man. Nobody wants to read that. And they're not coming with that baggage. They have a completely different perspective. And I love reading that stuff. Yeah. And it always existed, but it's just much more available now. So, I've sustained it firstly because I can't always be on the, you don't make money from records anymore. You make it from gigging. Can't always be on the road and always doing gigs. So I supplement my income by doing writing, and because I have a great time doing it. Look, I get to interview Bob Dylan and Pete Townsend. It's like, it's not that hard a job, but it really is, because it's incredibly meaningful.
Is there a book in you waiting to come?
Well, I wrote, I co-wrote the Orbison biography with his kids, and I co-wrote Slick's memoir last year with him. It's come up a lot lately because more than one person has said, just take all your interviews and put them in one book and, tie them together with stories, pretty much like the unedited, not like the little bit we got in the pieces, but like all, if there's 3 hours one afternoon with Jimmy Page, give us all 3 hours. It's not really how books work. I mean, you could do an ebook that way. But books, the publishing industry is about making money. I've had a couple of things where people have suggested, I wanted to do a book about the Clash, but I could do it, but it would be a lot of work, and I don't know that anybody would buy it. I mean, there'd be a small group of people who would buy it, but I don't know that it would break through. There's a book about rock history that I've been talking about doing with a friend of mine who's a manager for a major artist. Maybe when he retires and I'm doing less gigs, that'll be something we tackle if it's still of interest. Yeah. But I think that's part of it too. There've been so many rock memoirs. What is there to write about? You're dealing with really esoteric moments and pieces of rock and roll history, and good. I want to read all those, but they're not for everybody, and they're very sort of bespoke in their audience. And I'm also about the immediate. Look, I'll go back to the John Lennon thing. I'm about the immediate, man. It's like, I read a piece. It's instant karma. I want it out there. How quickly can this go up? I make a record. Oh my God, it took so long to get The Last Day of Summer out because I had a label, and there's like a rollout for those things. And you have a publicist, and they want to do a single, and then they're going to do another single, and then they're going to do a third one, but it's going to be secret single. It's like, oh my God, put it out. But there is a lead time. You don't want to put it out when everybody else is coming out with their record. You don't want to put it out, you want to put it, there's a whole method to doing that. Whereas, I've got new material. I just want to record it and put it out. I'm not recording it because once it's down, I'm going to want to play it. I'm going to want to get it out there. It's, making me a little bit crazy. So, a book is that's like, I don't know, 2-3 years of your life. Screw that, man.
It's interesting when you talk about working with Slick on his story, working with the Orbison family on that terrific achievement with Roy's life. Collaboration seems to be a very big part of your creative journey, and particularly with Last Days of Summer out of 24. Congrats, by the way. It's a wonderful album, and the production on it alone is really beautiful. I find it a wonderful album from a sound perspective. It's sonically just a really terrific listen. When you get to tracks like Moving On off that album, I think that's my favorite track off that album. I love the groove on that, and yes, there's echoes of homage, I guess, or a tip of the hat to 1980 when you've got Slick on there. Could you talk a little bit about The Last Days of Summer? And I'm curious about that track just from my own perspective, because I really dig it.
You know, the record was originally in early 2020. I just came off the road. Slick and I have been asked to do a series of gigs in the fall of 2020 around the anniversary of Double Fantasy that were going to be part multimedia, part Q&A with a group on stage, and part us with a band playing some of those songs and other John songs, I guess. And so we were going to make a record because, you know, you have a record to sell at these gigs. And when the pandemic hit, I already had a couple of songs ready. And I figured, well, screw it. I'm just going to keep writing. And I was doing these weekly online concerts. So I was keeping myself fresh all the time. And so the original 10 or 12 songs are probably not at all the 10 or 12 songs we ended up recording, but it started with Heartbreak because everybody was at home chomping at the bit for something to do. So I just, you know, I laid down the acoustic guitars and a little guide vocal and a click track and sent it to Paul Weller's drummer, and he added some stuff. And then I sent it around to people, and, you know, everybody added their pieces. And we quickly realized that, and by the way, it was collaborative because these were all friends of mine.
Yeah.
You know, yes, a lot of them are, you know, they either play with or are famous musicians, but they're also my friends, you know? Yeah. So, but we realized we could make it sound like we were in a room together, that technology had come to the point, and we got this great guy named Dwayne Lundy who mixed it, who made it. We gave him a jigsaw puzzle, and he made it sound like that, you know? And it's beautiful. It's absolutely, absolutely beautiful. Mm-hmm. So shout out to him, really. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to keep doing this. And so throughout the pandemic, I just kept making that record. And then when the world started to open up a little bit, and Slick and I were able to go to a recording studio and start working together on stuff with other people as well. I think all the basic tracks were there, you know, the drums and the bass and all that stuff had already been done. And when he and I were in the studio, you know, I had always heard Moving On as, you know, it's named after Yoko's answer to I'm Losing You. And I'd always heard Moving On as a son of I'm Losing You. You know, I wanted that groove.
Yeah.
And I wanted that swampy vibe. And I didn't tell the guys who played on the basic track that that's what I wanted.
Right.
But it did come out that way. But it was, I mean, there was one point where the producer put on all these vocals and guitars, and it sounded like the fucking Eagles. And I'm like, no. And Slick and I got on in the studio, and we started doing guitars, and it started getting that feeling. I got McTalbot, who was the keyboard player in the Style Council, who played with Paul Weller, to do the keyboards. And he really had that cool, swampy, you know, it's the roll in rock and roll.
Yeah, there you go.
And when it came to the solo, Slick did this thing, and I said, okay, do that 8 more times. Because I wanted that wall of guitars at that break to hit you really simple, but really powerfully, just track guitars the way they had on I'm Losing You. And I didn't tell him until after we were done. He said, well, you should have just told me that's what you wanted. I know how to do that, you know, but I didn't want that in his brain because he would have played it the way he played it then. I wanted him to find his way into that. But when Dwayne was mixing it, he was sending me roughs because he was in Kentucky, oddly, when he was mixing the record. That's where he is. I was like, no, it's got to, you know, it was like less. You know, I wanted it to have that Double Fantasy vibe. And I think in my head, Double Fantasy was sort of not the model per se, but there was something about the sound Doubles and Fantasy is a great sounding record.
I agree.
It's a really well edited record. The songs are like very precise. I wanted a bit of that. I wanted it to be really clean and really like what you said. It sounds great. Put headphones, great. Put it on, it rocks. I wanted that. It swings. It's got that swing. Andy Newmark's line, "The Family Stone," obviously knows how to swing. So I was. That was sort of my goal, but it was also a moment in my life going through and coming out of the pandemic where, life was shifting, life was changing. We were all sort of coming out of that the way I think John had come out of the 70s and his, sort of self-imposed exile, as people call it. This was a moment where this was the next chapter. There's a couple of records in my life where it feels like I'm now making, a manifesto for the next chapter.
Yeah.
And I really, I don't think I realized that until I started doing the interview circuit about it. But it kind of dawned on me that that's what it was. Because people started asking me about the lyrics and the songs and how we made it and whatever. And it became really obvious to me that was it. So again, it's like, look, not all the Beatles are hugely important to me. Townsend is, Ray Davies, Steve Marriott and Ronnie Lane. All these guys are just monumentally important to me in my life. But, and George Harrison, very much so, because he was so ahead of his time and he lived a lot longer than John. I could relate to him. And, in the anthology, he was so relatable because I think he sort of felt like he needed to be both George and John. He had to take on both personas to kind of tamp down a little bit of the PR part of things. That was, he had to be the George, but he also was a little bit sassy the way I think John probably would have been if he had been there. But look, at the end of the day, as much as I would say for a very long time that George was I do TM and I learned the sitar and, George is a really monumental character in my life. But, as I thought about it, it's John. It always comes back to John. Yeah. It's never not John. It may be George, but it's always, it's like, and I know, I had this conversation with Mark Lewis and he travels around the world and he tells me about how like around the world, the Beatles are really Paul and people have forgotten John. They've really forgotten the Beatles. It's kind of, he's the living representative of the band and everybody knows who he is and they associate that band with him. And he was, in many young people's eyes, the leader, and in many older people's eyes, the leader, because he's told the story. He's, the gift of longevity. Mm. And he said to me, it's weird when I come to New York and John is still kind of like part of the story. And I'm like, fucking ain't right, he is. It's like, it's John. It'll always be about John. John was what attracted me. Slick says this, it's like all the guys look cool. The hair was cool. The guitars were cool. The suits were cool. John had that attitude.
You got it.
Yeah. He was like, don't. And I will tell you, like one of the greatest things, the first time I ever worked with Slick, this is like 2010. And we met before that, but this was in the studio. Things went well, things went badly, I had to calm down. I had to go out and have a cigarette and all this. And I was walking down Houston Street a couple of days later and my phone rings. I could see it was him. And I thought, oh, fuck, he's calling. He wants me to like erase the tracks. He hated it. It's like, because you have this fear when you work with somebody like that. And I picked up the phone and he goes, and I just want to say, I love that. I had a great time. Can't wait to do more. I got to tell you, working with you, it was like working with John. And I went, okay, we're going to take a moment here. I'm going to hang up the phone because this conversation can't get better than right now. And I'm just going to deal with that for the rest of the day because you just made my fucking life.
Yeah.
5, maybe 8, no, I guess about 8 years later, we're on a stage in my hometown facing the record store that I bought Double Fantasy and Milk and Honey. He's right here playing those fucking riffs. Like we did one of the John songs. It's like, why are we adding this to the set? Because when I introduced that song, I'm like, I'm looking at the record store that I bought those records in on the day of release. And here's the guy that I read about in those liner notes. It's like, how much better could life be? Like, that's what you get as a creative person. That's what you get as a musician. That's what you get. You know, it's like you get to be a part of the story in your own small Wikipedia way, you know? And it's like, you know, yes, it's nice and I'm able to make a living and, you know, that's incredible. You know, I'm incredibly grateful for that every day. However, I didn't do it for any of the, you know, getting recognized or any of that stuff. It's because John and that band lit a spark under me to want it, to try for it. It felt like I could do it. And it's still there because that's the one thing everybody says when he walked in the room, that charisma was just like, he was always John Lennon, you know, and that wasn't them ascribing that charisma to him. It was just like people who didn't know who he was. He would walk in the room and they're like, who's this guy? Because it was electric, you know, and that's true of all of them, but him most of all. And the ginger. No.
That's so beautifully said. I want to thank you for being so generous and so open and sharing so much, Jeff. What comes next for you when you look down the road?
We just moved our residency here in New York City to Cafe Wah, which is a legendary place, and they're trying to sort of rebuild its legend, and so I want to be a part of that. Going out on the road a lot this summer. I think my agent and I talked about it, and we're aiming to do 60 gigs this year, which for a guy at my level is a lot of gigs. You know, it's a lot of travel, a lot of gigs. But I've come to really love it. I've got an amazing band where I'll tease it here, but we're gonna do something around the one-to-one concerts and the box set release. And you know, you may see some of these people we've talked about in those shows. And you know, look, I'm going to be going over to England in the summertime, mainly to see Oasis, but Slick and I were invited to go over to Weller's studio and do some recording. He was going to be on the last record, but he couldn't find his place in those songs because they were finished. And his manager said to me, he's like, you know, come over and start from scratch. And I'm like, yes, please. So, you know, we'll do that. I've talked to Daniel Lanois about doing, you know, playing him some demos and working on those. And, you know, Dave Stewart worked on this record. So that'll be part of, you know, hopefully he'll be a part of that. But I'm in no rush to make another record because I feel like, I mean, I'm not equating it to these records, but I know when Tom Petty made Wildflowers, he felt like, how do I top this? You know, how do I do anything as good as this? And The Last Day of Summer really did feel like something that was magical, you know? And I remember, you know, there's enough time between when we recorded it and when it came out that when I had to listen to it in preparation for the interviews, I was listening to it fresh, you know? And I was like, wow, I'm incredibly proud of this record, you know? It's not perfect. It's not, you know, it's not going to sell 1 million copies, but I feel like I did things in that record that I always wanted to do. I accomplished things I always wanted to accomplish. I played with people that I love and who understand what I was trying to achieve. That's just an incredible gift. So to try and top that, it's almost like, let's just go in and do 10 songs live in the studio. You know, just like, Weller's got his band there. I know all those guys. I played with all of them. Let's just go in and play and knock it out. Slick on guitar. There we go. You know, but I don't know. You know, I don't really know. I don't really know what's next because Lanois, he would sculpt it and we'd do it, you know, one piece at a time in a church or something. Who knows? So it's just, you know, but doors are open, and that's an incredible feeling at my age and my position. So I think that's what's next. I don't know. I mean, there was a point, I will say there was a point pre-pandemic where, you know, I'd done liner notes for the Beatles and Bob Dylan. I interviewed just about everybody. And I said to my agent, I'm like, I kind of feel like, you know, where do I go from here? there's no more mountaintops.
Yeah.
And she was like, there's always more mountaintops. You just don't see it, you know? And after that, this record happened. I interviewed Bob Dylan, and he's like I wouldn't have even ever predicted that. I mean, that's like blows my mind. Like that didn't happen to me. That's another guy. Yeah. So you just don't know what's around the corner, and you know, do your TM and kind of stay in the moment and be here now, and you know, see what happens.
well, Jeff, you gave me a mountaintop today, so thank you so much for
this was fun. This is fun. You know, they're you know, I do all kinds of podcasts, and I love doing all of them, even when they're focused on one song or two songs or one album or, you know, whatever. It was fun to talk about stuff that I don't really get you know, opportunity to talk about. Nobody, when I do the more broad things about myself and my career, nobody wants to talk about the Beatles. I mean, they might ask about them in passing, but to be able to talk about John in the present tense, because I think about him in the present tense. They've gone a really, you know, far longer than he was here, right? But I certainly, in the last couple of years, and part of this was making that record, he feels present. You know, talking about him with Slick, writing that book, getting to know Sean a little bit, you know, he just feels so present. That Mind Games record felt really very 2025, and it's very 2024.
Yeah.
So it was, you know, I'm going to carry that with me, and it was nice to talk about him not as a historical figure, but as like an inspiration who's ever present.
Absolutely. I remember just listening not long ago to the Elemental mix in the box set through a set of cans, and it's so sparse and open, it just breathes, and he's right there. And you realize too just what a beautiful vocalist he was, beyond that rock voice. But when he's just sitting in it and doing those ballads, you know, Out the Blue or whatever it might be, and it's opened up and it's just the piano, and you go, oh my God. It's a complete rediscovery and a great reminder of just how rare he was.
I mean, I think that's the thing. You know, I've talked a lot to the Elephant's Memory guys and Slick about, you know, he was very insecure about his voice. I talked to Yoko about this many years ago, you know, and I got a preview of the box set and obviously saw the movie early on. I wrote about it and talked to Sean about it and the guys from Elephant's Memory as well. And one of the things that keeps coming up is, you know, that voice is just unreal.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, why in previous reissues of that one-to-one concert that got buried or, you know, specterized or whatever. Thank God it's there in its true form, because if you just put that fader up and just the basics of the music around it, you're going to carry the day. It's going to be awe-inspiring and riveting to watch or just listen to. Those new mixes, the Record Store Day release, they're just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Sean, he's really found a way to make his father feel present for all of us.
Yeah, well said. Yeah. Jeff, a great honor. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Appreciate it.